Cops who have arrested or pulled over other cops, what happened? Not sure if it counts exactly as asked, but this happened in 2009. I've got a background in law enforcement, so as an Army officer recovering from combat injuries, I found myself as the operations officer for a post-based DES, Department of Emergency Services, which included the MPs and law enforcement for the post of the base. My office was across the hall from the actual MP director's office. He stepped in and asked how busy I was. I was busy but wanted an excuse to get away from the monotonous work I was working on, so I said, "What do you need, sir?" He was handling a case personally and wanted another officer as witness in documentation and processing. An officer's wife had been convinced to come in by a couple of other officers' wives. She was a mess. Face was swollen, and even though she had cleaned herself up, she was hard to look at without just getting pissed. Female officers, of course, did the actual inspections and documentation, but the director was running the investigation himself. He had called the officer off patrol and confronted him with me present as witness. Dude tried joking off that he had just gotten hammered and a little bit out of control. To cut the long story short, his case was transferred to a civilian police department for her good, not from reprisals or anything, for benefits. He was convicted of DV, which put him out of the MPs and lost him his ability to own and carry a weapon. So he was also discharged from the military, losing his career. I believe he also served some time in a civilian jail, but not 100% sure. She was granted a divorce, and because we sent it to a civilian court and he was not court-martialed, she still got to keep the divorced spouse married for over 10 years for her and the kids, instead of losing all benefits, which is why it was transferred to a civilian department. I really like that director. He did not tolerate BS from among his officers. Story 2. When my cousin was hired at the sheriff's office, he was assigned a mentor to help him get up to speed on the job. While the mentor was a well-respected sergeant, about a month or two into his training, the sheriff had my cousin come into his office to give him a new assignment. The assignment was to investigate his mentor without his mentor knowing he was doing so. The instructions the sheriff gave him were kind of vague on purpose. Since he was still new at the job, my cousin didn't think anything of the situation and thought it was just a training exercise. After about 2 months of investigating and doing what he thought he was supposed to do, the sheriff called him in for an update. He asked what he'd learned. My cousin thought this was a test to see how he was doing on the job, and so he presented the sheriff with what he'd learned. The sheriff's reaction wasn't what my cousin was expecting. The sheriff was both disappointed and pleased. With the sheriff reacting the way he did, my cousin thought he'd messed up and did something wrong. It was in this meeting that the sheriff informed my cousin that what he'd been doing was a legitimate investigation and that yes, it was a sort of test to see what kind of deputy he'd be, but it was more about having someone impartial or without bias investigate, so that there'd be no chance someone would overlook things on purpose and let the guy being investigated get away with it. The sheriff was very pleased with the job my cousin had done, but disappointed that the sergeant was doing what he'd suspected. The guy being investigated was due to retire in a year. However, there were complaints filed against him and discrepancies in some of his reports. Turns out he was using quote-unquote civil forfeiture as a way to steal people's things and then selling them on Facebook Marketplace when he thought he was in there. My cousin's investigation led to the sergeant being fired, charged, and then sent to prison. Story 3. Probationary officer goes on a blind double date with his roommate. They were at a racetrack drinking, so they took the train downtown. Everyone is pretty tipsy, him in particular. Maybe to entertain or show off for his date, he's acting all goofy. As everyone is getting off the train, he sees some guy bent over tying his shoes. The rocket scientist decides to leapfrog over the guy, only neither of them have much balance. Probationary cop basically jumps over on the guy and drives his face straight into the pavement because he's too tipsy and the guy wasn't expecting it. Everyone jumps up and he starts trying to defuse the situation he just caused. Turns out the guy is a high school kid heading down to spend the weekend with his grandparents. The tipsy cop starts saying stuff like, "It's okay, it'll be fine, I'm a cop, it's all good." When he realizes the crowd isn't going to let him just walk away, he bails and tries to run off. A few guys chase him down and grab him. Cops get called and detain him. I was the on-call detective who was called out at 10:30 to handle the case. He refused to answer any questions and was booked in based on the extent of injuries and age of victim. He never made it off probation and resigned. I wrote up and submitted the packet to the DA for prosecution. Nothing was swept under the rug, and trust me, a guy like this is not wanted by the police department. He was a probationary officer, so it would be easier to terminate him. The case was put through the system by the DA, and he ultimately took a plea deal. A plea deal is very common across the entire spectrum of cases, whether it be vandalism, theft of $1 billion, substances, or charges. It is probably the most commonly used tool for adjudicating cases, so don't think a plea deal was arranged because he had been a cop. Remember, he was arrested and charged by the same department he was a probationary officer for. Story 4. I don't totally watch someone get their mess rocked and let the aggressor go free. I watched a guy stumbled out of a bar from across the street once, looking like he was plastered and on a different planet. A second later, a bouncer came charging out and struck the back of the guy's head. I told my wife to call the cops, and I walked over and kept telling them to not touch him. The bouncer wanted to keep giving him shots after he struck the deck, despite the guy clearly not looking to fight back. Turns out he had fallen over inside the bar, broke a bunch of chairs, and spilled a bunch of drinks, so the bouncers grabbed him and literally tossed him through the doors. The guy was so disoriented he didn't know where to go. He just stood there, and then the bouncers screamed at him to leave. When the cops showed up, the bouncer and other bar staff immediately tried to lie. I walked to the side of the building with one other officer and explained exactly what I saw and knew clearly. I wasn't drinking, and it was very obviously the bouncer that struck this guy that caused the injury. I ended up giving another statement over the phone about a month later. The tipsy guy ended up taking the bar to court over all the damages, injury, loss of work, trauma. I believe it all ended up in the bouncer getting probation. The bar paid the guy a load of money, and the tipsy guy lost his job too, but got 4 shiny new fake teeth. Story 5. Not me, but my dad, who was a cop. He was still working as a full-time cop before switching full-time to firefighting and made a traffic stop around 11 at night back in the mid-80s. Nicer car, speeding well over the speed limit, so my dad initiates a stop. Before he is out of his cruiser, the driver has what looks like a badge hanging out of the window. My dad walks up, does the usual song and dance, and the driver says, "You obviously can't see who I am." My dad says, "Yes, Lieutenant Colonel, I do, and right now I'm conducting a traffic stop." Turns out the driver was a colonel in the Ohio State Highway Patrol, which is pretty high up in their rank structure. My dad again asks him for his license and insurance, and the guy goes off, threatening to call Direct Celeste, who was governor at the time, and threatening his job, that he was just trying to get back to Columbus after quote-unquote an engagement, and so on. Eventually, my dad writes him a ticket, and while still screaming, Mr. Pulling Rank drives away. The next shift, my dad gets called in by his assistant chief and is asked about the stop, and apparently the colonel of OSHP was calling him about it. They had to bring in the other officer to write a statement of what went on, and in the end, nothing came of it except the ticket wasn't contested and paid. Story 6. Former police officer and correctional officer here. I never actually arrested a fellow cop myself. However, my field training officer was arrested and fired from my former PD twice for tipsy, disorderly conduct before I worked there. He got his job back twice, again through union arbitration, and to his credit, gave up drinking. When I was working at the jail, we had a cop who was put into protective custody after being arrested for stalking a woman he met on a call. He got obsessed with her and kept bothering her after the fact, and after she reported him, he made threats against her. A fellow CO at my jail was arrested for producing and distributing graphics. He's doing 25 years in prison minimum. He won't be eligible for parole for another 15 years or so. We had 7 officers at the jail beat a disabled inmate and then lie about it on their reports. The shift commander then tried to erase the video. All were fired and arrested but were later acquitted of all charges. Sad thing was, they were all guilty. Story 7. I actually have had to arrest 3 separate members of the justice system this year. First, a practicing lawyer and former judge who had been utilizing his position to coerce affection from defendants. He utilized this leverage even after he was not a judge anymore. Investigation by DCI revealed he had about a dozen victims, so a warrant for his arrest was made, which I executed. Arresting a guy you used to put defendants in front of is a very odd feeling. He weaseled out of prison time and got it all suspended and put on a direct supervision probation program. I've seen guys do way less and get way more time, but it's not really a secret that money has a habit of tipping the scales of justice. Next was a prison guard who strangled his girlfriend, then stalked her relentlessly. I actually arrested him twice because after he posted bail on the first one, he was spotted lurking outside her home only 45 minutes after being released. He's currently on felony strangulation of a household member and felony violation of a protection order. He's still in my jail awaiting trial with a bail that has been substantially increased. I'm anticipating prison time for him, but only time will tell. Third was a city police officer. I'm a county deputy sheriff. We received a call from a kid that his dad was in the garage doing substance and wouldn't come out. Showed up to find four young kids running around unsupervised. It was a city police officer smoking substance that he had confiscated during a traffic stop and not reported or turned into evidence. DCI took the case from us due to potential conflict of interest and placed him in another county's jail, and I haven't heard any more about it. Hope he does time too. The year 2020 has been a very strange year for me. Story 8. I'm from Brazil and I'm not a police officer, but my grandfather was. He was a colonel of the military brigade, Coronel de Polícia Militar in Portuguese, where from the north of Brazil, and in the 1960s, in my state's countryside, conflict with Native American people was very common, my grandfather told me. The titular officer for the city was capturing Timbira people protesting for their land. I remember him specifically saying something about tied up people in their backs. That detail stayed with me. My grandfather's grandmother was from the same aldeia. I'm not sure of the English term, but they shared the same ethnicity and city. And because of this, he had a more sympathetic view of Native Americans than most Brazilian police officers in the 1960s. When he witnessed the police's actions in that town and was called to oversee the conflict, he arrested the man responsible for targeting men, women, and children. The man was demoted, but his replacement followed the same approach and nothing changed. That's what my grandfather told me. I'm not sure if it's true, but it seems very plausible based on what I know about Brazil. Story 9. This was during my time as a United States Marine Corps MP. Never arrested another police officer during my other gigs. Got a phone call from the guy's wife saying he was hammered and refusing to leave the house. Knocked on the front door, but found him crying on the porch about his wife leaving him because she wasn't happy anymore. She walked by the porch and motioned for me to come inside through the glass door. She proceeded to show me the red marks on her, the hole in the door that he punched through beside her head, and some other evidence that doesn't need to be disclosed. After asking him to come inside and get dressed, he refused to leave with me. I wasn't going to handcuff him in front of his kid, but he decided to take that moment to run from me. He was faster and got away for about 5 minutes before I found him walking through a playground a couple buildings over. Caught up to him, he punched me but was taken into custody after a slight use of force. On the way to the station, he tried to kick out a window in my cruiser and told me I was ruining his life. He ended up getting charged with about 7 different charges and was kicked out of the Marines. On his way out, he lied to NCIS and got an investigation open on me. Investigation was completed thoroughly and all charges against me were marked as unsubstantiated, but the charges still showed up after I got out and went through a background check for my security clearance. 10 out of 10 would do again. My slight inconvenience was totally worth it for him to go down for domestic charges. Story 10. Just an Air Force wife here with some perspective, also active duty myself for this story, but that is almost beside the point. It's people like you who save lives and families. I was active duty and a mom to an infant married to active duty. Local cops wanted nothing to do with us for political and other reasons. It took me calling into base security police and things ultimately getting escalated to OSI for me to get safe from serious maltreatment. If it hadn't been for my local military police, I wouldn't be alive today. I know this. Your actions probably saved a life or two. I know firsthand how difficult it is to call it in on your own people, and your willingness to be the person who did the right thing is remembered by people like me. I'm so sorry you're living with the blowback from making the right choices, but from the other side, thank you. Story 11. Ex-sheriff's deputy here. One night on shift, I had the great misfortune to be overhear on the radio that a small local chief of police, the whole department was only 3 people, was not answering a radio call. So my shift partner goes out to the call that they were trying to get him to go to, and I make my way to try and locate this chief of police. On my way to the police station, thinking maybe he's just asleep on the couch, I see his squad car pulled off onto the side of the road. At that moment, my heart sank. My first thought was, oh no, this dude just got a ticket on a traffic stop. As I'm walking up the car in a hurry, I notice that he is slumped over. I reached into the open driver's window and grabbed his shoulder to try and put my fingers against his neck to feel if he has a pulse or if his skin is still warm, and generally to check to see if he is in fact still alive. As I'm doing this, I notice a distinct and strong odor of a drink as the chief of police wakes up, looks at me, puts the car in drive, and pulls away. About that time, another deputy pulled up behind my car and I put out my radio that the chief was driving off. The other deputy, forgetting that we all use a shared frequency, then comes over the radio and says, hey, he should be easy to follow if his lights are on. the lights go off. Fast forward to several hours later, command staff are out at the police department seizing the weapons and evidence that are stored within the department. This chief of police shows up with the mayor of the small town and submits himself to a breathalyzer. He barely passes. Fun fact, district attorneys do not like prosecuting chiefs of police, especially when police are starting to get involved. Unrelated to that, I was let go about 2 weeks later for calling a suspect unprofessional conduct. Seems like that is a really low level of termination for getting let go. Story 12. I once pulled over a sergeant from a neighboring jurisdiction for speeding. He had his badge out the window before I even got up to his truck. I calmly explained because of his speed and it being near a residential area and a school, he'd be getting a ticket. Came back with a ticket and told him I'd forgo the lecture but asked him to just watch his speed. I thought it went all right and never heard anything about it. 9 months later, I had actually applied to the same sergeant's agency and was going through the background phase of the hiring process. That sergeant found out I was a candidate and started bad-mouthing me over there, saying I was rude, unprofessional, and all sorts of stuff during the stop. Next thing I know, his LT is coming by asking to watch the video of the stop. The officer doing my background is coming by to watch video of the stop. The chief of the department I worked for was pissed off he was acting like such a baby over a ticket and issued a directive saying if an off-duty LEO identifies themselves as such in an attempt to get out of an infraction, the officer shall cite them and call the chief so he can contact their chief or sheriff. It was such a storm over a simple speeding ticket, although I did end up getting the job at the new agency. Now if you're enjoying the video, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 13. I saw a true crime video because her wife was trying to divorce him and she had a really nice life insurance. He was struggling hard with bills and apparently the crime split the whole police department up. People who thought he was guilty versus people who couldn't believe it and thought he wasn't guilty. In the end, he was caught because he was the only one who had the keys to the car she drove and the police found a paper with calculations on it that were how much he would have left over after the life insurance money paid off his debt and his house, and he was sleeping around with a coworker. Also, to add to context on why the department was split, the side that was on his side were coworkers for years. They simply couldn't believe that someone they have worked along with could do that. He had a good reputation at work, but at home, he was different. The evidence I said was pretty much the last missing factor because the cops had a very hard time building a case. He covered his tracks really well, plus he made sure he had a strong alibi. He honestly would have gotten away with it. In the beginning, he was helpful and gave as many statements as the cops needed, but the more evidence the cops were picking up, the more he started getting resisting and wasn't complaining anymore. He was actually very harsh towards her, but she was the main breadwinner of the house. She got tired of it and was trying to move on and settle the divorce as calmly and nicely as possible, but he wasn't complying. It got to the point he would break in at the house whenever he wanted and stuff, plus he would leave her recorded messages on the home phone. Since she was a nurse, she recorded all calls because sometimes her patients would call her and ask questions, but when the cops searched her place, they thought it was very weird how those tapes from his calls were missing. After all, he had a key. Plus, the incident was done in her work parking lot and his alibi was strong, but it seemed very plotted. On top of all of that, they did get confirmation he rented a van. The same looking van that the suspect jumped into after he ended her at the parking lot. Police couldn't trace the license plate because they were going off by the cameras from the car dealership. I'm pretty sure it was a car dealership across the street. It was too far to get a clear reading on it. Oh, and he had a very good reputation at work. He had a ton of circumstantial evidence against him, though. Story 14. Not a cop. Yep, yes, I know, but this is a hilarious story. The city police department had gotten their first internet computer in the early 2000s, and one of the two female officers was having trouble with the computer. She had spent an hour screaming, hitting, and yelling at it before pulling her weapon out and striking the computer. The other female officer, who is my sister's future MIL, had to take her down and arrest her for unlawful use of a service weapon and destruction of municipal property. The charges were dropped because she asked if she could instead quit without her pension and benefits and go to therapy. Now she's been living life as a grandmother and helping kids with anger issues. Another issue, more serious, an officer, same PD, was charged and convicted of unlawfully manufacturing and selling weapons. He was using a pawn shop to help sell them because they had a federal weapon license and was forcing the owner to sell him parts for a cheaper price. He was also found to be selling the substances he took off of people. The police department has taken so many hints from these incidents that the city forces them to have multiple cameras in the cars. All officers have to have body cameras they can't turn off unless they're going to the bathroom, which they have to do in the department. They also can't have their weapon directly on them at their desks. They have to be locked in a safe next to their desk to deter them from pulling it out and shooting a computer. I've decided not to work there and to find employment with a department that has a better reputation, which sadly is hard. Story 15. I was the head of the unit dealing with offenses and child protection. We served a number of police precincts called a cluster. A young woman was arrested for theft at one of the police stations that were under us. Her mother was the complainant. The daughter had a serious substance misuse and had previously stolen from her mother, who gave her a last warning after the second to last time. A substantial amount of cash had gone missing, and when confronted by her mother, the daughter denied any knowledge of it. So, deciding that it was time for tough love, she took her daughter to the police station, opened a case, and had her arrested. Later that evening, the mother discovered that instead of hiding the money in the inside pocket of the coat, which was hanging in her wardrobe, she had inserted the envelope containing the cash into the coat sleeve. In other words, no theft had taken place. She immediately returned to the police station, explained to them what had happened, made a withdrawal statement, and was told her daughter would be released imminently, but that, because the case docket was already with the detectives, only they could release her and not the uniformed police in the charge office. Enter the rotten apple of a detective. Upon hearing that a withdrawal statement had been made, he booked the suspect out of the cells and took her to his office, where he told her that he could make the case go away if she did something nice for him in return. Only upon returning home and hearing her mother's profuse apology did the daughter realize what had happened. Cue the complaint, the docket of which ended with me. Long story short, we summarily arrested the detective, a seasoned veteran of more than 15 years of service, recovered the used protection in his office, and he was convicted. I don't remember the exact sentence, but it was in excess of 10 years. Something that really struck me, how quickly the arrested cop became institutionalized. There are certain mannerisms which convicts have which are hard to accurately explain but easy to spot when you look for them. It's in the way they walk. The gait is affected by leg irons, so after a while, even when not wearing them, one can spot it when they walk. Especially when in a hurry, there's something identifiable in how they move faster using small steps. I'm not sure I can explain it better, but I was shocked to see that after only 3 months in detention awaiting trial, some of the traits were already setting in. So how was someone who was that horrible allowed to work that job for 15 years? Can you imagine all the other things he might have committed in that time? Yikes. Story 16. Not me, but I haven't seen anyone mention the video from a few years ago when the female cop ran down another cruiser that was going way over the speed limit and didn't have its lights on or call in anything. I don't recall names, but she saw another cruiser burning down the highway and took off after him. She followed him for a few miles and finally got him to pull over. Once they stopped, she got out and pulled her weapon, ordering him to get out over the speaker. He ditches but finally gets out, and she puts him on the ground and in the back of her cruiser. The dude had no reason to be going that fast and was doing it just because he was a cop and thought he could. It was national news when it happened, and if I remember correctly, thousands of police departments across the country were doing illegal record checks on her, which goes into a system. But that'll come later, and she was getting threats in her mail from police officers everywhere. I don't recall what led to the discovery, but she found out about the illegal background checks on her and won a ridiculous amount of lawsuits. Story 17. I'm an actual cop, so I'll give an answer. I've arrested 12 cops for DUI, 2 of which included charges of possessing weapons while intoxicated. I've arrested 1 cop for writing a check on a closed account, another for violating a protection order during a very ugly divorce. I assisted the feds on a couple tax-related arrests. I've also arrested a total of 3 cops for dereliction of duty. One of those cops was a cop who didn't arrest or conduct a DUI investigation after a crash involving another cop. All those cases proceeded in a similar fashion as other people with similar backgrounds and criminal records have had with similar offenses. The slap on the wrist is actually very common and the norm with first-time offenders. Also, the things I've found cops arrested for are generally the same things other middle-class blue-collar workers get in trouble for: issues with substance abuse, particularly alcohol, and financial problems. My career is perfectly fine. I've faced absolutely no negative repercussions from any of my peers. I'd say if you work for a large enough agency, you've probably arrested or written a ticket to a cop. The world needs good cops like this one to get rid of the bad ones, right? Story 18. Not a cop, but a former dispatcher who filed a complaint against another dispatcher for jeopardizing public and officer safety. This person did not like me and would intentionally withhold information and not enter it into CAD, causing me on radio to have delays in responding to officer questions. When I finally had enough and reported this person to the assistant chief, I was sent home. 2 days later, I was fired for abandoning my post even though I never left. I called both the chief and the assistant chief out during my termination for this being a case of good old boys and collecting my personal belongings. To this day, people ask me all the time why it is when they call 911 in this particular city, they get told hold. My response is usually that the dispatcher is most likely finishing their game of Candy Crush first. At this point, I do not know if the dispatcher is there anymore. I know the admins have changed with retirements and mayoral appointments. There is a group mentality to being a dispatcher or a cop, but by and large, most do the work because they want to serve their communities. Being a dispatcher, even for my short time, was both the hardest and also one of the most rewarding things I've done. There are calls I'll never forget, both for the sheer horror of them and also for the absolute insanity they brought forth. Thanks to all who read and upvoted this, and please take a moment to consider that the person on the phone when you call 911 or emergency services rarely gets closure when you call. All too often, when we send out the appropriate people, that's the end for us. There are calls that shake you to the core, and forever you wonder, did I do everything I could, and are they okay? Story 19. I called 911 once as I heard a man screaming for help in the woods behind me. I had my own address, but obviously not the address of the incident. It was the woods between my address and the cemetery behind me. I told her to send officers to the cemetery. They'd hear him. She just kept laughing and saying, "Oh, honey, we need an address." I told her the cross streets, reiterated that he was screaming, and she laughed, then sighed, and I could finally hear keys clacking as she asked for the name of the cemetery again. At that point, I lost my mind. I said that I'm listening to a man passing away, and if she thinks this is funny, then I guess I'm gonna go see what it is up by myself. Her response was, "Oh, bless your heart, hun, it ain't that serious." I hung up, but she must have sent someone because I saw an officer slowly perusing my street as I was getting my shoes on. Then by the time I got to the cemetery gate, there were a ton of officers and an ambulance. I saw an officer prowling my land later, so I asked him what was up. Yeah, the guy was being beaten and he was in a coma. They didn't catch the perpetrator, probably because of the slowly cruising cruiser with its lights on. I still want to find that 911 operator and show her how wrong she was. It made me realize I really do need a weapon in the US, though. I tried to find the police records but failed. It was Green Lawn Cemetery, Wilmington, North Carolina, in either 2014 or 2015. Have at it, internet sleuths. Story 20. In my short time in law enforcement, I never arrested another cop, although I did arrest correction officers, both for domestic crime-related incidents. But I did have several officers I knew well who arrested officers from our agency, and even worked with a couple of guys who ended up getting arrested. I only knew one guy catching flack for arresting a fellow officer. The officer arrested was well-liked and the offense was pretty iffy, the kind of thing you wouldn't typically arrest a random person for. However, it came out later that it was just the tip of the iceberg. Most cops I discuss these matters with really have no problem with you if you arrest another cop for legitimate reasons. Professional courtesy is definitely a thing. An officer will likely get the benefit of the doubt. If you commit a borderline act, an officer is likely to turn their head the other way. It's called officer discretion, and most officers will do the same for nurses, teachers, other first responders, or just someone who is kind. But if you have legitimately messed up, you are most likely going to jail. The cops exist that will do everything they can not to arrest a fellow cop, but they are definitely rarer than the public thinks. Story 21. I have many stories. My dad did internal affairs, not his choice, which I'm sure many aren't. But if anyone is interested, I could type out a couple of scenarios that he was a part of. They ran what they called integrity tests on suspected officers from other officers, letting them know they were breaking the law and abusing the badge. In one such case, they put an undercover officer who was a black officer in a nice car from impound, had him drive normally down a highway. The suspected cop was patrolling. They would put a substance or a bag of money under the driver's seat. There are cameras and microphones placed throughout the vehicle. Upon pulling the undercover officer over, they would have him exit the vehicle and search it. Once they found substances or money, they would take a bunch and stuff it into their vest and then tell him they found nothing and he could continue on his way. In most cases, this was thousands and thousands of dollars and or lots of substances. They allow the officer to finish his shift, and before he gets home, he's arrested and interrogated. They offer him a choice: be fired and keep your pension if he can also tell them other officers who do the same thing. Because some crowds roll together, or not say anything and be fired, no pension, and possibly jailed. Either way, never be an officer again. If they honestly didn't know anyone, they would still lose their pension. Story 22. Used to work for the police and arrested a few cops. First one was my first shift ever on the beat. I was walking around the city and had a complaint about a guy who was calling women names and yelling about how ugly they are. I wasn't too fazed. I thought he was probably just tipsy. As we walked over to speak with the guy, he started yelling about how he was in his right, and we all agreed. You can have an opinion, but just keep things quiet. It was a very simple conversation, and after taking his details to issue a ticket, he just snapped. He threw his briefcase at my partner. Well, we had a warrant for arrest, so took him down and cuffed him. As we took him down, his glasses and hurt him. Nothing major, so we took him back to the holding cell. At this point, he said to me, "My real name is Joe Big Blow." We all had a laugh. I finally got some time to run his name through the system, and boom, police inspector. This is one of the highest ranks in Vic Poll. So being an inspector one, I called my boss. She came in and said, "This guy used to teach at the academy." Then he ran at her. That doesn't go well, and he ends up on the ground with a big lump on his head. After a few hours, he sobered up and was sent home. The court case carried on for 3 years. I've since left the force, and he was fired shortly after that altercation. Story 23. Not a police officer, but here's a story. My dad was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma. After his final round of chemo, he was in rough shape and on a feeding tube. I moved to NC in order to help him out for a few weeks and take care of him. He wasn't permitted to drive, and he could barely even walk. He was in such rough shape, sleeping about 23 hours a day. One morning, I had to wake up early for his doctor's appointment. It's about 6:30 a.m., and I'm laying in bed while I hear a boom outside of his apartment complex. While I'm contemplating what happened, the noise happened a second time. I look outside the window, which has a direct view of the road. My dad's truck is all crooked in the parking spot, and I immediately get nervous. I quickly go check on him, and to my surprise, he's not in his bed. I run out to the living room and find him sleeping on his sofa. I quickly wake him up and start yelling at him, asking if he drove his truck. He couldn't remember, so we both immediately ran outside and found multiple vehicles completely annihilated. Keep in mind, his apartment complex runs on a loop, and there's one main road to get you through the whole place, and everyone parks on that main road. As we're outside, someone shouts, "He's up by the clubhouse," which is like 100 yards away from us. My dad can barely walk, no shoes on, we're both in our PJs, yet he scurries around to his pickup and finds his truck completely smashed all around his tailgate. Another truck nearby completely had his front end pushed in. We were all surprised because these are full-size trucks and it's hard to do damage like that to a truck. We end up walking to the clubhouse where a tipsy man is trying to buy a soda in the vending machine. We call the police, they show up, and we eventually find out there's 3 more cars completely destroyed, one complex ahead of ours. Turns out he was incredibly tipsy and used substances. Once the cops came, they wouldn't arrest him at first, so we started asking questions, and it turned out he was the captain of that local police force. They had to wait for the highway patrol to come arrest him. It was a crazy day, and there's even more to the story after the incident. Story 24. My dad was a cop. At the time, my parents were going through a divorce, and my mother had a new boyfriend of about 4 months. Boyfriend was a jerk, struck my mom, told my sister if she didn't have a job, he had to move out. I fought the guy a couple times myself as I was in middle school and pretty big, never got crazy serious or anything. Well, my dad hears about all of this and tells my boyfriend he better not hurt or threaten anybody in his family ever again, including my mom. Boyfriend goes crazy and starts cursing at my dad, calling him all sorts of names. Skip forward a few weeks and my dad gets a call from my sister that the boyfriend is threatening to kick her out of my mom's house if she doesn't get a job soon. So dad goes over to pick my sister up. Here's where it gets interesting. My dad, a trained cop who's part of the SWAT team, was a running back in college, benches more than 405 at the time at 230 pounds, 6'2", sees the guy and the guy just books it. It's one of those animal instinct things where mom's boyfriend knows he messed with the kids, so he starts running, and this only infuriates my dad. Dude runs out the back door into the alley and my dad chases him, catches him about 4 houses down and just struck into him. My dad knew he should not have let his emotions get the best of him. He called the cops on himself and the cops came and arrested him. Dad lost his badge and everything. Dad was set free the same night and 2 days later gets a call from his lieutenant and they talked for a while about the situation. A couple of more days go by and Dad gets a call back telling him he needs to come pick his badge back up and gets his job back. Funniest part is, Mom's boyfriend then hears about this and tries to sue my dad. Judge decided my dad was defending his family and was only required to pay for the broken glasses and didn't even have to pay the hospital bills. Mom broke up with boyfriend a couple weeks later. Story 25. I used to be the supervisor for the hostage negotiation team. Our offices were together with the SWAT team, so almost all of our call-outs were together working as one big joint unit. Everyone is going to get called at all hours of the day and night, so one night I got this call from my lieutenant at 3 o'clock in the morning to be downtown at the main headquarters as soon as I could. No more details than that, even when I pressed for more info. So of course, one's mind really starts to wonder, what did I do, is what starts going through your mind on the drive down. Once in the roll call room, I meet up with the other SWAT officers and supervisors. Same thing. What do you think we all did? One guy says, we just asked for take-home vehicles. I bet it is the brass showing us that they can get us out of bed in the middle of the night to chew everyone out just for asking. After a couple of minutes, he walks all the top brass along with several FBI agents. The briefing was that 6 officers and 1 sergeant had been escorting and protecting shipments of substance through the city. It was an undercover operation with an undercover FBI agent and fake loads of dope. Also, they were paid several $100s. The sergeant was paid $2,000 to $4,000 for setting it all up. He was the brains behind it all. So we were to break up into 6 teams of a sergeant, 2 SWAT officers, and 2 FBI agents, each taking a substation precinct house. All these officers worked the daylight shift, so we were to make the arrest hopefully just before roll call when they could possibly be alone and outgunned. The whole time I'm thinking to myself, this is crazy. There's no way that 6 guys could get together and pull this kind of thing off. Most of them were idiots. Luckily, our target came to work early that morning as we were set up with the SWAT officers on surveillance in the parking lot and myself with the FBI inside. The target officer walks in with his weapon belt around his shoulder and the signal was given to take him into custody. It was a pretty smooth arrest without any problems. I said, Manuel, these guys want to speak with you. After they tell him he's under arrest and read him his rights, all he says is, okay. At that point, I realized it wasn't crazy. They all pleaded guilty to a couple of years in federal prison except one who fought it and ended up with 7 years. And if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hearing me out on this one.